more than Sanskrit verses from him. You will have fireworks with both of them here. Actually, all the sessions have been very, very scintillating in this ThinkEDU. But I think this is the session I have been particularly looking forward to. For a variety of reasons, I'm a self-confessed fan of Bibek Debroy and Ashwin Sanghi both. And any number of times I hear them, there is something which excites me, makes me feel younger. So one part, and the second part is this I think in some ways a continuation of lots of things we have been doing. There was a session yesterday whether we have textbooks, lessons from epics, and you disputed that the epics was not the right word. There was itihas, and then we talked of various things like nationalists, ultranationalists, urban Naxals, and so on. And there's been a discussion about what India is all about, what India comprises, what our racial memory is. And I think that's where Ashwin Bhai's page turners come in. Because, you know, I think when yesterday the discussion was taking place between Amish and Bibek Debroy, and Amish was referring to what is not itihas, not mahakavyas, but basically myths. And the interesting part is that are we confusing myths with history? That is one major discourse going on in this country. And when we say ancient, are we only talking of Hindu India? I think that's where Ashwin Bhai's books have been exciting me, that you read something which is very, very contemporary, political murder mystery kind of thing, something like Foucault's Pendulum or Da Vinci Code, and then you suddenly realize that this man is administering to you a very subversive dose of history, which is, and history is written by victors, and there is that beautiful Kritika's anthology of poems. If lions wrote history, what would be their view on this? Vision of the vanquished. And I think Bibek Debroy repeatedly makes this point, that when we read Ramayana and Mahabharata, we each one of us draws a lesson for itself. So I was a little confused about the title, and I will shut up after this preamble. When it says that modern lessons from ancient India, do we define modern as contemporary? Do we define ancient as a period of history in NCERT textbooks? Are we talking in terms of lessons of history? And then we remember that those who forget lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. And there is that quip that history repeats itself first time as a tragedy, second time as a farce. So we get stuck in these cliches. So I would not waste much time and ask Bibek Debroy to carry on where it was left yesterday before we come to Ashwin Bhai, that are we talking of lessons which each individual reader derives about dharma and dharma, morality, or are we talking of lessons which are prescribed for us for some present problem?
Good afternoon, and thank you, Pushpesh. No, I think that title, misleading though it may be, was put in there to accommodate him and me both. He's the modern, I'm the ancient. Ancient texts, I completely agree with Pushpesh. I have no idea what it means. So let me give you an example of an ancient text. And I'm not going to give the obvious one, the Bhagavad Gita. Some of you here will know that the Bhagavad Gita is only one of several Gita texts. And there is also a Gita text which goes by the name of Ashtavakra Gita. Ashtavakra was a young sage. I don't have the time to get into the history of why he came to be known as Ashtavakra. And he went to the court of King Janaka. This King Janaka is not the same as Sita's father Janaka. The Janakas were a lineage, so there were several kings named Janaka. Janaka asked Ashtavakra, and I will translate, Katham Jnanam, this is the first shloka of the Ashtavakra Gita. Katham Jnanam avapnoti, katham muktihi bhavishyati, vairagyang bakathang praptang etad bruhi mama prabho. How do I get knowledge? How do I get emancipated? How do I develop non-attachment? And notice I'm using the word non-attachment, not detachment. Oh Lord, tell me this. These to me are perennial questions. They're perennial questions even today. Whatever be the definition of modern, whether it is yesterday or today, These so-called ancient questions are perennial questions. And what in one sentence is Ashtavakra's lesson to Janaka? Get rid of two notions, aham, I, and mama, mine. That's it. Modern, as defined today, is when every day in the morning I get WhatsApp and Twitter messages and email messages saying, read my article, watch my interview. Modern is characterized by I with a capital I. And the perennial lesson that our texts have is get rid of that I, get rid of the aham, get rid of the mama, and then you come to the perennial question of who am I and why am I here.
Would you agree, Ashwin bhai, or would you have a different view?
No, of course, I can't say it as eloquently as Bibek da, but my limited understanding is that I tend to take what we refer to as the myths. I take them a lot more seriously at times than I do history. And there is a reason for that. Because it was C.S. Lewis who said that a myth is a lie that reveals a truth, because at least myth is not making any pretensions, is not attempting to be a sequence of facts that happened. The effort in a myth is to seek a deeper truth. But at least with history, my favorite definition of history is the one offered up by George Santayana, who said that history is a pack of lies about events that never happened, written by people who were never there. So in that sense, history is just a version of events. So to that extent, my view personally is that there is more for us, probably. And the one thing that we seem to learn from history is that we don't learn from history. So my personal view is that probably there's more to be learned by searching for a slightly more deeper truth within our so-called myths, which, as Bibek da rightly said, it's itihas. Maybe that might offer us an alternative perspective. My view has always been that I think if you take, for example, a book of mine like Chanakya's chart, it was based on a reading of the Arthashastra. But the problem is that somehow or the other, these two twin concepts of dharma and arth down the ages, somehow we've only now begun to focus on arth. And the dharma bit has got pushed more and more and more to the background. I have always looked at dharma and arth more as, you could say, Saraswati and Lakshmi.
I wish you were here yesterday, because I think we were debating this dharma, artha, kama, moksha.
But it goes back to what he just said, that the I versus the broader, the more macro, is somehow now becoming much more evident, because it's all about I.
Bibek, I would like to ask you the same question which I was trying to trap him into, that isn't there a dharma of kam and isn't there a dharma of artha? And the dharma is always present, whether you are pursuing artha or kam.
Well, I'm not going to avoid the question, but first let me react to something that he said. I suspect that the reason the expression ancient text is there is because there was a session yesterday which mentioned the epics by which the Mahabharata and the Ramayana were meant. And here, although not explicitly stated, the reason the ancient text expression is there is because there was implicitly a reference to the Puranas. The ancient texts are the Puranas. There are 18 Mahapuranas. Together they amount to 400,000 shlokas. So taken together, they are 4 times the size of the Mahabharata. The Puranas are not just about stories. We may take them to be stories because of whatever comics we have read and whatever badly done TV programs we have seen. The Puranas are encyclopedias. So today, most of our normal functioning of dharma is based on what is in the Puranas. If today a temple is constructed in a certain kind of way, the background to that is in the Matsya Purana. If today we have our funeral rites in a certain way, the material for that is in the Garur Purana. There are young people here who are familiar with the fact that mantras are sometimes chanted. At the end of the mantra, you're familiar with people saying, Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Why is Shanti being said 3 times? Why not 15 times? Why not 6 times? Why specifically 3 times? I think this is a question that the answer to which should be known to everyone. The reason we do not know that is because we have dismissed all of this as ancient. The difference between the ancient and the modern, if I am going to give a definition, is the following. In terms of that modern lens, we understand everything in terms of our relationship with the external world. External objects, external other human beings, other creatures, spouses, parents, sons, daughters, grandparents, bosses, subordinates. The message of these ancient texts is that the answer does not lie in relationships with the external world. The answer lies within, which requires reflection, which requires taking out 30 minutes a day for yourself, the person you love the most, which means spending half an hour on silence instead of this modern notion of perpetually having to talk, rebut, debate, tweet. That, I think, is the critical difference. Now, so far as the word dharma is concerned, it's heavily overused in different kinds of contexts. Dharma, there is a definition of sorts which doesn't say very much. It says, Yah dharyate sa dharma. That which holds up is dharma. So whatever holds up good behavior of sadachar is also dharma. Good governance on the part of the king is raja dharma. Emancipation is moksha dharma. And exactly similarly, when I'm pursuing artha or kama, there are certain principles of good behavior I have to follow. That is also dharma. So indeed, there is a dharma associated with artha, there is dharma associated with kama, there is a dharma associated with everything. Because dharma is that which holds up.
I want to ask you a specific question.
Sure.
Most of your books take us back and deep down into history. Racial memories, myths, history, whatever it is.
Yes.
Is there a conscious effort to administer a lesson somewhere in the narrative? Like, take for instance something like the Sialkot saga, take something like the Krishna Ki, the Chanakya chant, Rosabelle line.
Right.
They are set in contemporary times.
Correct.
But the roots of the conflict go back.
Yes.
You don't actually come out to Punarjanma.
Correct.
But the parallels are there and the
Correct.
things go back. I'm
Yeah.
asking this with a specific reason because I
Sure.
want to ask Bibek the same question.
Sure.
When we say ancient, we talk in terms of Hinduism and normally
Right.
we think the Hindu period.
Right.
But there is a period pre-Hindu
Yes.
Dharma,
Of course.
Bhagavad Dharma or the Sanatan Dharma crystallizing, where you have a Buddhist India, you have a Jain India, you have the Lokayat India, and you have a pre-Islamic world.
Correct.
And you have a pre-Christian world. And these worlds are interacting with India, which exists then.
Of course.
So the memories of the ancient go back to Indus Valley civilization,
Sure.
pre-Vedic Aryan religion,
Sure.
before the Upanishads and so on.
Right.
And then do you lead your reader up the garden path, so to speak, to conclude that this is the perennial
You're
truth?
basically asking me if I'm a fraud. And that's fine.
I don't believe that.
But yes, I do lead people up the garden path because that's what thriller writers and storytellers do. But having said that, I think for me, the fascination, Pushpeshji, is that is there a kernel of truth in what is being offered to us? And then it allows me to examine that what-if question. And that what-if question probably holds some lessons for us. I have, the most interesting incident in my life was walking into a temple in Kolkata where I found that the deity being worshipped was Amitabh Bachchan. And walking out of that temple and picking up a little prayer booklet, which was known as the Amitabh Chalisa. And at that moment, I thought to myself, I said, supposing the cult of worshipping Amitabh catches on, and 1,000 years from now, you don't have one temple, but 1,00,000 temples. Now, isn't it possible that if I take rebirth at that time, and someone asks me, do you think Amitabh could have been a real man? That would be a valid question 1,000 years from now, but that's precisely the so-called valid question that we are asking ourselves today about so many of our stories. So I think, thank you. So I think that there is some learning which we can take from our stories, but I must tell you, to answer that first question, that is there an objective? I believe that I am a storyteller. I have no qualifications to be a storyteller. When the press first asked me, when my first book came out, that what is your qualification to be a writer? I said, during my growing up years, my mother used to tell me that I was a bloody good liar. So that is what I have carried on doing, telling lies. Now the point is that my job is to entertain. Along the way, I may end up giving you some information that you didn't know before. That is the element which we are talking about today, educate. And finally, by the time you reach the end of the story, there may be an aha moment where you think that why did I not think of this story this way? Or why did I not see that connection? And that I consider to be the moment of enlightenment. So it is entertain, which is 70%, educate, which is 20%, and enlighten, which is 10%.
Vivek, this leads us to a very interesting fundamental question. Isn't all great teaching storytelling? You come to the Bible, the Old Testament, there is Gospels. You come to Upanishads, there is a story what Nachiketa did to Yama, what Yam did to Nachiketa, what Udalak did to his son, etc. You always have entertainment, packaging an important, what you would call, and I would agree entirely, answer to a perennial quest, perennial problem. Isn't Bhagavad Gita also a story? A battlefield story, you don't know what's going to happen, a person has a failure of nerve. So isn't being the Indian tradition that all knowledge is packaged, information and useful knowledge is packaged as entertainment, as a story, whether it is Ramcharitmanas or Valmiki Ramayana or the Puranas, as you know much better than anybody else. And I would just add a small rider to it. You've been a professional teacher as well. If you cease to be entertaining, you will bore your students to death and they will not learn anything. So doesn't a professional teacher also entertain?
Yes, of course, the teacher does entertain. But a good teacher is also a teacher which knows the level at which the student is and tailors his lesson accordingly. So for the ordinary person, Adi Shankaracharya composed stotrams. For others, he wrote a bit more advanced texts. And for the ones who are really advanced, he wrote composed the Shankar Bhashya. In exactly the same way, if it is meant for ordinary people, and I don't mean the use of that expression in any normative sense, I will package them around stories, as the Ramayana does, as the Mahabharata does, as the Puranas do. But if it is for people who are a little bit more advanced, then with solitary exceptions like Brihadaranyaka and Chandogya Upanishad, normally in the Upanishads I will not have the stories that much. So the entertainment is packaged according to the target audience, because there is entertainment, and there is entertainment.
That's right.
But let me now respond to something else that you said earlier. The only reason I used examples from something like Ashtavakra Gita is because I'm familiar with the Hindu texts, I'm familiar with the Buddhist texts and the Jaina texts, not the others that much. And I happen to think that the question, that Janaka's question that I started off with, that's an universal question. There is nothing particularly Hindu about it. Now, what appeals to me about these texts is that they are very empirical in nature. Now, eyebrows will be raised. Here we are talking about dharma. How can dharma be empirical? The reason it is empirical is there is something out there, let us not give it the name of God, which has a very different kind of connotation. Let's call it the Brahman, let's call it the Paramatman, call it what you will. No rishi has ever said, I know what that Brahman or that Paramatman is like. They've always said, Vedaha metam, this is what I have experienced. And what I have experienced may be quite different from what Pushpesh experiences and from what you experience. In that sense, these are all empirical in nature. In that sense, they do not have a template that applies to everyone. They are very individual. And that is what appeals to me intellectually.
I would like to ask you, I think you've been unnecessarily modest. There is 70% entertainment, 20% information, and 10% whatever. But you ultimately, when you tell an engrossing story, you make people think.
Of course.
And when people think, that takes us to a fundamental question of teaching, learning.
Right.
That do you only learn a lesson when it is taught to you, or when you are provoked and you start an inquiry heuristically on your own? You go back to the entertaining text, you may take off from the entertaining text, you might go to a comparative text of that entertainment text, but you raise questions and find answers for yourself.
Of course, but I do believe in the theory that in case you cannot entertain, you're not going to get someone to turn the page. And if you cannot succeed in getting someone to turn the page, then you've lost the battle right there. So that is at least the school that I'm coming from. Because I grew up reading potboilers and mass market literature, as it were. But yes, for example, today, let's say a text like the Arthashastra, I genuinely believe that it still has tremendous relevance for us even today. And in fact, I mean, at times when I look at the Arthashastra, I feel it is almost a perfect manual in governance. And I wish that someone was actually reading it in order to figure out as to what are the learnings from that could be implemented today. Because I genuinely believe, that is the reason why a book like Chanakya's Chant goes 2,300 years back and forth. Because I want to show that a lot of those learnings of 2,300 years ago are applicable even today. It is in that context. You have to make it relevant. I think today, the truth is that the younger generation wants these stories, but they want them packaged according to their sensibilities.
I must apologize. These two gentlemen know. I've got a flight to catch, so this is going to be my last response.
So let me just add to your, before you go, Rush in a hurry, would you please make a brief comment about the relationship of fiction shedding light on past and fiction supplementing the standard texts like Arthashastra, Kama Sutra, Upanishads and Puranas?
Oh, I love them because anything that gets people interested in our texts, I welcome it with open arms, whoever it is. So that is a straightforward comment to the so-called fiction. But the two comments I wanted to make, the first comment is Vedavyas was a great, great entertainer. I don't know if you are aware of how the Bhagavad Gita thing happens in the Mahabharata. In the Mahabharata, Sanjay is supposed to describe to Dhritarashtra what happened. Dhritarashtra is impatient to find out what has happened in the course of the war. And Sanjay says, Bhishma is dead. And Dhritarashtra says, what do you mean? Bhishma is dead? How can Bhishma has died? And Bhishma, of course, dies after 10 days. But instead of answering that question, having introduced that dramatic element, he goes off into the Bhagavad Gita. So Veda Vyas in his time was a great, great entertainer.
A page turner.
A page turner.
Thank you. Prabhu Bhai, I think he is rushing off, so.
Yes.
We shall continue.
Pushpesh ji, we are left holding the fort. I will move.
आपकी तो फ्लाइट नहीं है ना?
हाँ?
तो I have a flight before.
नहीं मेरी कोई फ्लाइट नहीं है. आपकी अगर नहीं हो तो मैं बैठा हूँ.
I have a flight, but बैठिए, आप बैठिए.
Otherwise, I will be left completely holding the fort.
I think what we'll do, we will throw it open to the audience right away, because we have been discussing this amongst ourselves. I hope we have about 10 minutes.
How much time do we have?
10 minutes. So we'll open it to the floor. Lots of, I think, 2 hands raised first. Kindly reach the mic to the grey T-shirt. Lovely.
Beautiful.
Check. Okay, the issue with learning from ancient texts mostly seems to be that whenever we ask for what lessons, the answer comes whenever there's a discovery from the Western thought or science. The answer is, oh, we already have it somewhere in the ancient text. Mm-hmm. And that has always been the response. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering, is there any 1, 2, 3 things that we can list that the ancient texts have revealed, which the Western thought or science has not come up with yet?
Well, I think we are unfortunately living in a world where everything becomes political. Everything has become political. And so we very often are attempting to find connections. So for example, in the Ramayana, if we refer to, let's say, the Pushpak Viman, then that becomes treated as the evidence for ancient aviation. Now, I have a problem with that. Because my personal view is that we should not be doing that, because in the event we do that, we end up taking ourselves a lot less seriously about the things which were actual achievements. So whether it was, for example, the discovery of the zero, or whether it was, for example, the first forms of plastic surgery, those are the things that we should be talking about and which we should be digging into, and we should be having research teams getting into those areas which we know that there is a connection to. Personally, I find that we are very quick to jump the gun and say, no, everything came from India, everything good came from us, which I think is taking things a little too far, because we run the risk that when we will say that this was actually from us, we will not be taken seriously. It's the boy who cried wolf too often.
I would differ slightly from him, because I think the answer to your question is even more straightforward. India was a far more higher civilization before the West was having plumbing or WCs and things of that kind. So there's a statement of factual history. So we also were ruled by Westerners. We suffer from a colonial mentality. We suffer from some kind of inferiority complex, and we jump the gun, as he says.
Not only that, but the other issue also, Pushpesh, which I just want to add to, is the fact that colonialism essentially converted what we consider to be our history into mythology. So to a very great extent, I mean, today, for example, you take some modern day events, contemporary events. Let's take one single year, 1857. A boy growing up in India, a student growing up in India, reads about it as the Great Rebellion of 1857. But an English child growing up in the UK reads about it as the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. So ultimately, nazariya badal jata hai, itihas ka. And that is the point, that to a very great extent, a lot of our history, unfortunately, we have not allowed multiple points of view to emerge, because the only way that you can maintain a semblance of the narrative is, we did this with the Ramayana. We had 300 plus versions of the Ramayana. And for a scholar like you, you are fully aware that some of those narratives vary dramatically So, I mean, when you read something like, let's say, a Tulsi Ramayana and Valmiki Ramayana, there is a difference because of the fact that one is treating Ram as a god and the other is not. Or you go down to the, let's say, the Anand or Adbhut Ramayana, you have Sita playing a very different role, manifesting as Durga and killing Ravan also in one of them. The Lao Ramayana, Ram is a Bodhisattva. The Muslim Ramayana, he's a Sultan. I mean, the point I'm making is that we allowed 300 versions of the Ramayana to flourish. Why did we do that? Because we wanted it to be multidimensional. Because then you could pick and choose your own truth, what suited your sensibilities. We need to let that happen even with Itihas.
And draw the lesson accordingly. Sir, you were waiting to ask.
Good afternoon. My name is Ganesh. I have two questions. Question number one, what do we tell our children? These Puranas, these stories, do we tell them as truths that really happened, or do we say, just listen to it, take the message from it, leave it at that? This is my first question. Second question. We have always been accused of, tinkering with the Puranas, not promoting it and promoting an alternative history. I think the morning sessions were, replete with that. My question is, have we as a nation in the past, or as a civilization in the past, nation is a very new thing for us, failed to write history? Because I have, in my little knowledge, understood that we Indians were third-rated history writers. And because of that, we had to, and I'm quoting Discovery of India, from a more academic perspective, that the understanding of Indian history was put together, aggregated from the criticism of the Indian history which the Westerners did of us. So have we as a civilization failed to document history? These are my two questions. Thanks.
So to answer your first question, Pushpesh, you want to take one of them? So the first question was that should we tell them that this is what you get from it? Or should we simply say read it and then take away the core lesson from it? Is this the truth? And the question that I ask myself honestly is that I don't know what the truth is. How do you define truth? A person I look at an apple which is red and I say this is red. But if you happen to be colorblind and you are looking at that same apple, it's going to look greenish brown. Now the question is, I will say it's red. You will say it's greenish brown. Both of us are actually speaking the truth because we are saying what we observe. But the truth lies at a different point. I can't remember who it was who said that there is my story, there's your story, and then there's the truth. So, to my mind, the way to tackle this with youngsters who are introduced to this material is to say, read it, and then decide for yourself what you think is the truth. That is the only way to do this. We should not be spoon-feeding it to them and saying, this is what it is. No, because, in our country, we have always been much more focused, unlike, for example, the Abrahamic faiths, which are more about religion. But if you consider really the dharmic faiths, they are much more about philosophy. And the fundamental difference between philosophy and religion is that philosophy is questions that can never be answered, and religion is answers that can never be questioned. So the two things are very, very different. So I personally feel we should be introducing our youngsters to it and saying it's philosophy. Hopefully you will have 10 relevant questions emerging from your reading of this. That's what I feel.
Questions there? The lady.
Good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Avantika Krishna. And my question to the panel is something I've had, a doubt that I've had ever since I was a child due to Amar Chitra Katha. So my question is, despite all the tapas and meditation, why was Vishwamitra so angry all the time? Why were sages so angry? I've seen so many curses through those Amar Chitrakatha pages.
I think Vibekda should have been here because his words have been wasted. Because what he said, the problem arises when you can't get rid of aham. The problem with Vishwamitra was that he was born in a Kshatriya, couldn't get rid of his hubris or a pride of aham, and he wanted to become a Brahmarshi. The Brahmins, being the eternal crooks that they are, had designed the system where the Brahmarshi could only be a Brahman, so he wanted to get the Brahmagyan and become Brahmarshi. And ultimately he ended up in, pardon my French, Italian, Russian, German, screwing up Vishwamitra's happiness, Trishanku's happiness, who was stuck in the middle of the sky. So Vishwamitra's problem are problems of an egomaniac, a megalomaniac, who could not get rid of his hubris. One more problem Vishwamitra had. If you remember, when he was performing the tapas, Raja Ravi Varma's lithographs of a brilliant painting, Menka putting some halwa. Halwa, of course, came with the Africans, and his desire being aroused, and Menka was sent to him, and Shakuntala was born. So he lapsed from path of virtue more than once. We shall not get into his dog eating, but there is another story. So Vishwamitra had not one, but many problems, and poor Amar Chitrakatha, Lakshman Pai uncle, may rest in peace, couldn't do these adult-only stories in the Amar Chitrakatha.
Thank you so much.
I second that, by the way.
Thank you so much.
Question here.
Question to Ashwin Sanghi, sir. So, if you look at last year, Harvard University, they introduced a course on Indian epics. And recent times, you have seen many Westerners getting fascinated by Indian history and Indian epics and all. But most Indians, we take it for granted. I feel that everyone is interested about India other than Indians. So, what's your take on this?
You know, I think the starting point for getting global attention is usually when you create domestic attention for that particular subject. For the longest time, our myths were not fashionable. We were living in a world where if you were a commercial fiction writer, it was expected that you were either writing something which was in the nature of a saga, or you were writing something which was going to be award-winning literary fiction, or alternatively you simply wrote non-fiction, typically of the variety of how to make a good biryani. I mean, so it's only in the last, I would say, 12 or 15 years that commercial fiction writing has actually come of age. And for that, frankly, I must tell you, I mean, it's not as if commercial writing in India had not taken off. You had the Surendra Mohan Pathaks of the world selling lakhs of copies in Hindi, but it is just that in English it had not happened till the time that dear Chetan Bhagat came on the scene. So, which was the turning inflection point, as it were. Having said that, now we have a situation where suddenly stories which were completely lost from public memory are now coming back into our collective conscience. Our collective consciousness is now beginning to register these stories. And this is a country of stories. You know, I mean, there could be an Amish or an Anand Neelkanthan or a Devdutt Patnaik or an Ashwin Sanghi, and there could be another 1 million of us, and we would still not be able to scratch the surface of the number of stories that are available to us from, I'm hesitating to use the word, ancient texts. So the point is that as this movement begins to develop within India, I think the attention will go back to a lot of these stories. As far as the West is concerned, it has looked at it more from an academic point of view. The other day, Pushpesh, we were in Delhi, and myself and Pavan Verma were on a panel together, and we were talking about the Arthashastra. And the fact that we don't seem to be reading the Arthashastra and taking lessons in governance. But you know who is reading the Arthashastra? The Chinese. They are using our texts in order to actually use those texts against us. So currently the interest that you are talking about is academic and research interest happening around the world. But eventually interest has to emerge in the nature of it is popular interest which makes a movement grow. And that is what is currently going on in India. So I think the situation, it has taken 10 years for commercial writing to come to this point. It will take another 10 years to actually make these subjects more relevant to us.
I'm glad you mentioned Devdutt Patnaik. We'll just come to your question, sir, because I think this gentleman has written same story for children, for adolescents, for management graduates, and also for policy formulators. You have sudden interest in transgender, Supreme Court grants them right, and suddenly Ardhanarishwar and Shikandika become fashionable. So you go back. There are questions there, sir, at the end.
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
My question to you is that, do you believe the Mahabharata as a source of commentary on politics, religion and culture is underappreciated or under-researched? And my follow-up question is that, if you believe that the Mahabharata is history, if you assume it is history, where do you think that Krishna the god ends and Krishna the man begins? Because I believe that the character of Sri Krishna has been critically under-researched in recent times. So where do you believe that the margin ends? Like, where does Krishna the god ends and where does Krishna the man begins?
Okay. So the first question in terms of whether I think that the Mahabharata is historical. I am one of those writers who, unless I'm very passionate about a topic, I normally don't take it up. For me, the events of the Mahabharata, in and of themselves, as referred to as mythology, are not of interest. The possible overlap between myth and history is where my attention is, where my excitement is, because I genuinely believe in the equation myth plus history is equal to mystery. So from my perspective, I see many, many little pointers that tell me that no, this is not pure fiction. Remember one thing, the Mahabharata started, correct me if I'm wrong, Pushpesh ji, 25,000 verses of the Jaya. Then over years and years and years, it morphs into another work, which is 50,000 verses of the Bharat. And then eventually over years and years and years, it morphs into another work, which is 100,000 verses called the Mahabharata. The point I'm making is, and of course, I don't believe that Rishi Vyas was one person. I believe Rishi Vyas was a nomenclature, a designation. And there were probably hundreds or thousands of Rishi Vyases who eventually put the Mahabharata together. So if that is the case, do you think that people would have spent generations writing about an event or about a character like Krishna in case there wasn't some truth to that story? You may have done a lot of layering. In India we call it mirch masala. When we are retelling a story, hum mirch masala lagate hain uspe. Sure, I agree with that. But I believe that there is a kernel of truth.
I think that is the best question to end with, because as the question was about Krishna. Sorry, sir, we have run out of time. They say Hari Ananta, Hari Katha.
One small
Ananta.
question, sir. Maybe nice to end up with my questions.
All right, sir. Quick one.
I introduce myself. I am Vijay Kumar, Director, Wales Group of Schools. I have one question which is slightly away from what you are talking, and I would like.
Sir, then we'll continue with that question outside at the tea session.
No,
I think we are running short, and the next session is to begin. So thank you very much for being very nice audience, and thank you.